next to each other.
Yeah.
Should I turn like?
Okay, several people have their mics on. I don't like, normally, I don't like to mute my students. I've said that the first day of class, but I think we'll need to start that way. For now, maybe I even send an email. I've been too busy to do that. Just to remind you, the background noise is very distracting. I know no one intends to have that happen. So if you could, just to start each class, each Zoom session, have your mute on and then unmute yourself whenever you want to ask a question or a comment. All right, we have a lot to cover today, and it's going to be some of the most interesting and important works of art in the Western world. Of course, we're covering world art, so we're going to see some really interesting and important works from other continents. But our topic for today, our topic for today is going to be high Renaissance art. I'll define that in a few minutes. Okay. But first, I'm almost done. This is the last time I'm going to do this until I think it's week 4. Sometimes it's even week 5 when the administration tells us we have to do one final census as to see who might have dropped a class and then get our rosters finalized. So this is all I'm going to do. I'm not going to waste a lot of time. I'm only calling the names out of people that haven't ever answered here in the first 2 or 3 meetings. We've now had, this will be our 4th meeting, or who did answer once, but the very few, like 2 or 3, I still haven't received a mini bio from. I would still accept them. You know, that people have been asking, will you accept it if it's after the Monday deadline? The deadline was meant to encourage you to get them done, but I'm definitely going to, and I'll confirm when I get them. So these are a handful of people I still haven't either never heard they were here, and if this applies to anyone, I'll go ahead and say on this video, these will be the people I'll have to drop, because we have to do that by next week if someone hasn't answered present or notified us that they were going to join late. So that applies to Angelino Alcazar. One more last time. Nope, not here. Okay. And then I haven't received a mini bio from Colette Burham. Is she here? Well, I may try to, but I don't have everyone's email, so I'll probably have to decide whether or not. I'll check the roster. Of course, she may have decided to drop on her own. Then I also didn't get a mini bio yet from Mo Latresh or Latrash. Oh, this has been happening a lot more this semester. I almost couldn't get you guys online here because some stupid, I hate, anybody have that where it goes blurk error? I hate that, with this ugly image of a mop-headed, you know, piece of broken equipment. Try again later. Well, I couldn't, so I had to shut everything down, my laptop and everything, and start over. That's why I didn't get the invitation or the Zoom link to you as early as usual. Yeah, I think there've been some issues. Well, this is recording unless, yeah, definitely, I made sure of that. So, you know, if you miss parts, hopefully not more than part of any lecture, let alone a whole lecture, you will see them posted. And I corrected, by the way, last week's. I definitely will have this posted before 8 p.m. on Friday, probably well before that, but anytime after 8 p.m. Friday, you can see this whole lecture on YouTube, as well as the one from Monday. Where we were so rudely interrupted by a booting out by Zoom. Okay, 2 more people I've never heard yet from, so they will be dropped. If you know these people and they don't want to be dropped, they need to get in touch with me before Monday. Alex Ruiz. Oh, okay. Claudia Saldana. Okay. And then we had one new person. I don't know if she's gave this person an ad code. I've actually had several students add in both this and my in-person class. So I just want to make sure if they're here. Marianne Mungai, M-U-N-G-A-I. Not here? Well, I'll double check later then to see if she did actually get onto the roster, because if she's in the class, she should have received the invitation to the lecture. Okay, so here's what we're going to do today. First, just take like 2 or 3 minutes to go briefly over, just to mention the 2 main categories. If you look at your syllabus, you'll see that for this week, besides the new slides, which I think you'll agree are going to be very interesting, like The Last Supper, very controversial work of art. There's several possible meanings to some of the figures, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. But before we do the slides, though, I do want to just briefly mention two things that the new guidelines require us to, and I always did anyway. And they are these. First of all, mediums of art. That means the types of, we're talking about visual art now. It should be obvious that in this class, we're only going to cover things, that were in your textbook, let's put it that way, or that you might already have thought of, even if you never took art history before, as visual arts. But there are some others that the textbook doesn't cover and that they want us to at least acknowledge, which are more under crafts, but crafts can be art too. So here we go. Here are the major, let me let in, welcome, we're just starting. I'm just telling people what the major categories, that's what we mean when we say mediums of visual art are. Obviously, you've got painting, sculpture, architecture, photography, and engraving. We're covering those 5 categories because this class goes from the Renaissance forward. If we were covering ancient art, we wouldn't be doing the last 2. There were no engravings in the ancient world and no photography, but we're covering both. So those are the 5 first ones, but there are others. So again, that's painting, sculpture, architecture, engraving, and photography. In addition to that, there are ceramics are considered one of the fine arts. There's so many different types of ceramics. If you go to see the exhibit, I think it is the Egyptian exhibit at the Young, I believe you'll see a few of those kind of objects from ancient Egypt, but obviously still being made. So ceramics is another medium that we aren't going to go into too much in this class. I think we might have 2 examples. Then tapestry and quilting. I know some people think, no, they're not the same, but they're in the same general vein of types of, woven, stitched, or otherwise handmade art. So again, tapestry and quilting is another broad subcategory or medium of art. And then finally, I have to limit this to the major crafts, and that'd be furniture making. Furniture making is an art. I mean, I don't mean just chairs for, a mass audience, but individualized custom-made pieces of furniture, or as you may know, and if you haven't already taken ancient art history, my 1.1 class, we show close-ups of the tomb. And the tomb, but I meant to say the throne of King Tutankhamun, which is not at the exhibit at the De Young. It's all about another pharaoh, Ramses. Very important pharaoh, much more important than Tut. And there may be some ancient Egyptian furniture there. I haven't seen the exhibit. I'm going to go next weekend. And I'll tell you what the main objects there you might want to look at if you choose to go. You don't, of course, have to any museum for extra credit. All right, so those are the main mediums that most people would agree qualify as fine arts, visual arts. Now, methods of describing meaning. This is really important because these you do need to know about, and you don't need to use all 5 on your research papers or on the exams, but at least 2 of them, and really 3 would be good to describe the meaning. So first, okay, you may or may not want to write this down. Of course, it's being recorded. Illustration method of analyzing meaning. What does that mean? That's what story or event the artist was trying to depict. Whatever event or story that artist was trying to depict. So you can all guess that means abstract art doesn't have an illustration aspect to the meaning. They're not illustrating, Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, and we'll cover some of those later on, late in the semester. Those don't have an illustration aspect to their meaning. But any realistic style of art, any of the visual arts, can have an illustration aspect or method to understand the meaning. I'm going to to the Ramses. Oh, okay. Not sure if that's a new award show, maybe, that I've never heard of. Golden Raspberries, anybody know what that is? I'm sorry, I have a quick side. My brother created those. It's in its 43rd year, and he gets international attention for that because it's the Reverse Academy Awards. It's a lot of fun. It's always held the night before, and it's online, and it used to be in person before the pandemic. Hundreds of journalists from all around the world come to help and have already voted for the worst film, the worst actor, worst director. And you see clips of those bad films. So it's called the Golden Raspberries, and that's my brother's invention. Been doing it and emceeing it for 42 years, 43 now. Anyway, so let's do the other 4, and then we'll get to our first slides. Biography, you already kind of know this because we talked about how Michelangelo dissected cadavers. That's a good example of how an artist's life might influence their work. their life or events in it. So biography is one of the easiest. In fact, you should always have at least, if you're writing anything, whether it's your papers or on your exam questions, when it comes to meaning, you should do at least, if it's realistic style, illustration and biography, at least those two, to get full credit, full points. Okay, and then let's see, is there anybody else? Sorry, no, we don't have. All right, then we have three other aspects of meaning. You can use these to analyze, and you're going to hear me do that as we go along for sure today and all the way through the class. Context, that might not seem obvious, but what that means is the cultural or historical setting that influenced that artist's work. I'll say it again. Context is analyzing the cultural or historical setting that influenced an artist's work of art. Now that applies to all kinds of visual arts, even the most abstract or simplistic, and including even furniture and quilting and so forth. Oh yeah, let's do this. Sorry. Yeah, right. Thank you for that, because I so much on my mind, I don't usually remember that. So it's helpful when you do that. All right, so context is a good way of analyzing the meaning of a work of art. And you're going to hear that today, right off the bat with the first two Da Vinci slides. Okay, and then we have style. The style that a work of art is in, what style that artist chose to use is definitely part of the meaning. And it's usually not as interesting for some people or important, but it is part of the meaning, and it can qualify as part of your credit when you're writing in the research papers about the meaning of a work of art. Especially true for architecture. Especially, and I've read your many bios, and I noticed several of you say you had an interest in architecture, or you've been to architectural sites or cities with interesting architecture. And of course, in this class, we're going to cover quite a bit of that. So the style of a work of art, whatever type of art it is part of the meaning. And finally, the last and usually the most obscure or less obvious way to analyze the meaning is iconography. Everyone knows that an icon is on a computer. We're talking about the other meaning. The original meaning of icon was sacred image. And we don't go back that far. That's a medieval concept, or even late Roman times. But when we say iconography in the analysis, I'll be all right. Analyzation, there's no such a word. Analyzing of a visual work of art. What does iconography mean? It means the use of symbols and understanding what those symbols mean. For that, you either have to do a lot of research, or I will tell you when it comes to any slides, of course, if any important symbols are used. And you can use that as another aspect of meaning. Okay, so that's it. That's all I'm doing now. Now, we may briefly touch on a couple of the other elements that are not required for you to use in your papers. I said that on Monday. But for now, we need to move on to the slides. Okay, so we're going to do screen share here, and I just want to make sure everybody can see this and get it full size. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yep.
Don't all speak up at once. Yeah, thank you. It's important
Yes.
because, yeah, sometimes it looks like it's sharing and it doesn't. We've had that problem. Good. All right, here's your first must-know slide for today. The title is near the bottom of the first page, you see, of course, under today's date. Virgin of the Rocks. Virgin, I don't need to spell those words. Virgin, singular, of the Rocks, plural. The artist name, probably also, I don't think I need to spell, but I will. Da Vinci, of course, his last name was two words. Many European people's last names are, and here too, in this country, of course, or two words that together make up their last name. Da, D-A, Vinci, V-I-N-C-I. Now the little c, you don't have to remember that on the exam, if this is on the exam. Remember, any slide I show in class, until we do the review and I cut the list down by a third or more, you should assume, you should take notes and could be possibly on the midterm. Okay, circa 1485, we don't know the exact year. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a painting by a high Renaissance, one of the most famous high Renaissance artists. So now, of course, as we already did this on.
Excuse me.
Yes. Yes.
Are we taking notes on this using
I
the
just said that.
meaning?
Yeah, I just
Okay, so
said that. Yeah.
perfect.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Anything on the syllabus, I usually will say a must know. I think I did this time. I might have just said, yes, assume it could be on the exam. Yeah. So we haven't got to the meaning yet, because we have to give you a definition. Remember, always you should have always by now had this routine down with every lecture. Have next to your laptop or whatever you're using to listen in a list of terms to know and the syllabus for this class. So on the list of terms, everyone, let's go down to high, 2 words, of course, high Renaissance. What does that mean? My internet connection is unstable. Here we go again. God, and there's no storms. Hang on. I'm just going to pause. Now it went off the screen. Can people still hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I know in some cases individuals have problems as well as occasionally all of us. All right, here we go. This definition isn't very long. High Renaissance. The period from little c, remember, means about. Circa. You can write the word C-I-R-C-A if you want. It's Italian for about. It just a little c with it. So it's a period from circa 1480 to 1520, comma, during which the greatest artists of the Renaissance created their most important and innovative work. So again, it's that period from circa 1480 to 1520, comma, during which the greatest artists of the Renaissance created their most important and innovative works. Well, that's what this qualifies as. It's an early Da Vinci high Renaissance painting. He was a high Renaissance painter, and we'll talk about, if it's not obvious already, why he's one of the most important artists. Everybody's heard his name by the time you get to college, right? But we'll say why. First of all, he invented at least one, if not 2 new techniques that are found in this painting. We know he invented one of them, and I'll define that when we get to it. But let's talk about the meaning first. The meaning of this. It's a scene from the Bible. Okay, so it's the illustration aspect of meaning. You don't have to label the subcategories of meaning. Just write the meaning as I give it to you, right? Again, we'll start over at that. This is a scene from the Bible in which Mary, the mother of Jesus, that's her in the middle, right? Whoops, I went too far forward. That we'll get to that later here. There we go. In which Mary is in the middle, the mother of Jesus, is seen in a grotto. And there's no other word for it. Grotto, right? Just some of you know what a grotto is. It doesn't matter if you don't. That's what it is. A bunch of
I know
rocks
what it
in the
is.
stream. Right. Some people have never been to a grotto. I've seen them all over the
They
world.
have plenty of them at the Playboy Mansion.
Oh, really?
Yes.
No idea. I've never been there.
Well, I have.
Anyway, let's move on. This is a natural grotto, okay, which is a kind of, you know, outdoor, some people would say almost mysterious setting. It's meant to be mysterious in that this has no clear, exact, important statement to make. It's just a scene from the Bible, which illustrates the importance of the people involved. We have Mary, right? Jesus, and there's a debate as to which one of the babies is Jesus and which one is John the Baptist. But I think most historians, at least that I've read, think it's the one where Mary, being his mother, would have her arm around her own son. That's what many historians think. Da Vinci often wrote about his own paintings, but not about every one of them in detail. So we'll just say this is probably Jesus, baby Jesus. And then this would be John, who is his cousin, who later became the first Christian, the one that convinced Jesus to take up this new religion, right? Because they were all born Jewish, as you probably know. Okay, so this shows a family gathering. You could call it that if you want. Joseph, her husband's not in the scene. So it's Mary, mother of Jesus, and then probably Jesus, the one she has her arm around, and then Jesus's cousin, John the Baptist, and then her cousin over here, who's the mother of John the Baptist. So that's the illustration aspect of meaning. The style of this, we're not going to do all 5 elements or types, I meant, of meaning on every slide. We'll never get through the semester, just 2 or 3, like you should do on your papers. So let's talk about the context as, or no, style. I already actually said what it was. High Renaissance, because Da Vinci was one of the most important artists of the Renaissance, and this is one of his earliest, you could say mature, you know, very well executed highly skilled, you could write any of those phrases, works. He had been a student of painting before. So when he did this, he'd become a master in his own right. He had mastered the art of painting, and he created several new techniques. We're going to describe those when we get to the formal elements. But for now, you just say, in this painting, there are some new techniques of painting, that one of which at least was invented by Da Vinci. And it's in the period I just gave you the definition, right? So you have that from 1480, right? 1520. Well, here it is. It's in the 1480s. So it qualifies as a high Renaissance style of art, in specifically painting. Okay, and then we have the context. This is a period in which religious themes were the dominant topics for almost all paintings, and Da Vinci was very religious. And if you don't know this, he was definitely gay, and he didn't hide it, because in his case, with the rare exceptions back then, that most people, of course, would have had to hide that for obvious reasons. They often did up until recently in our culture. But back then, you could be punished severely for it. But he was such an important painter, such an influential artist, so popular, and so much in demand all over Italy. Cities, different dukes in different cities, you could say local rulers and cities all over Italy were competing to hire him to come to their city. So just say he was very popular and very much in demand. So he did not have to hide his, well, he didn't flaunt it, let's say, put it that way. He didn't, make a big show of it, but he didn't hide it either. And so he is indirectly, some historians feel, trying to show that after all, according to at least some interpretations of the teachings of Jesus, he would not have had a problem with someone being gay. He wouldn't have been a problem with at least the ideal interpretation of what, acceptance is the word. So it's kind of a subliminal, or some would even say hidden message in this painting. The acceptance of all people and all backgrounds. You're going to hear more about that with the next painting. Da Vinci had no prejudices of any kind. I'll explain why we know that's true in the next slide. So just say that it might have a hidden, many historians believe this is a hidden meaning of the acceptance of people from different backgrounds, which Da Vinci himself was, of course.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Is it true that they would stone if they found out people were gay? Did they stone them?
Sometimes that didn't happen too often. Usually what happened is they were excommunicated from the church, which is a big deal because everyone's supposed to go to church, and sometimes exiled from the city they lived in. And often their property was, if they owned a house or even
taken.
So they were punished, and they could be sent to jail and occasionally tortured. And I think I've read a few cases. Stoning was more in the ancient world that happened, but it did occasionally, I suppose, in the Renaissance. But in any case, now we're going to switch to the formal analysis. What you should notice about this painting is how dark the background is, right? Let's get up close, and you see all around Mary's head, including even below her neck, her own robes sort of blend into the background. That is not an accident. This is considered by some historians to be Da Vinci's first masterpiece. He did so many, even though he didn't do a lot of paintings, only a couple hundred that we know. He could have done more, but after about this time, he had become a master by the 1480s, and his paintings all have some unique quality or beauty to them. So what is it that I'm going to start with on the formal analysis? It's a type of modeling, and the word next definition now, so take out your list of terms, that you see here is chiaroscuro. Now, that is a word that's hard to pronounce and even harder to spell. Remember, all the exams are open book, open note, right? In both in person and online classes, at least for my classes. So you have the word in front of you. But now look at it. It's the second from the bottom on the first page of your list of terms. Now, this definition isn't very long. So I'll say it slowly, like I usually will, and repeat once the definition. It's a very important term. I almost guarantee this term will come up in more than one way on the first midterm. It's such an important technique. So chiaroscuro is a technique for painting invented by Da Vinci. Nobody debates that anymore. Again, I'll start with the first part of the definition. It's a technique for painting invented by Da Vinci, in which there are highly contrasting areas of light and dark to emphasize certain parts of the painting, period, in which there are highly contrasting areas of light and dark to emphasize certain areas of the painting. Well, once you look at this and you know that definition, it shouldn't be a mystery to figure out how that applies. Everything around Mary and the other three people, her other family members, her son, her nephew, and her sister, or cousin, actually it was her cousin, sorry, the mother of John the Baptist. All of them have a lighter emphasis. Their faces or parts of their bodies, in the case of the two babies, their entire bodies are well lit, and everything around them except the distant background way at the end of the grotto, off into the horizon there. Everything else around them is dark. That's a chiaroscuro effect. Even Mary's robes are so dark she almost blends into the background, because he wants you to mostly notice the people and their important roles in the story, this scene from the Bible. It's supposedly the first time that Jesus met John the Baptist, his cousin, who later convinced him to, like I said, to take up this new religion and preach it. John the Baptist, therefore, is considered to be the first Christian according to the Bible. So it's an important moment in the history of A, the Bible, and B, Christianity, and he wants to emphasize the people, not the background, even though look how much beautiful texture. Here we have simulated texture. Look at that on the rocks. He was a master at depicting realistic simulated texture. Mary's hair, right here, and the skin tones of the four people. And even though her robes seem to fade into this, if you look closely, you can see enough of the texture of a very fine gown. Now, she was a poor woman, and she probably couldn't have afforded clothes like this, but she's described in the Bible as the Queen of Heaven. When she died and went up to heaven, she became, quote, the phrase Queen of Heaven. You can actually put quotes around that. And so here he's showing her dressed like royalty. And that has very realistic simulated texture. It looks like some smooth fabric that she's wearing on her robe. And then a similar kind of fabric here, I would say, also smooth, perhaps satin or something, who he may have dressed the models in that. And then, of course, the skin and the hair on all four human figures is very realistic, or you could say sharp, either word will do, simulated textures. And of course, all the rocks in the grotto. Then we have rhythm. Is there rhythm? Oh yeah, look at these pointed rocks that project up. A couple of you said you'd been to grottos. I think, I don't know if anyone's been to Carlsbad Cavern. I think it's in Missouri. I can never remember. Is that New Mexico? I can't remember. First time we drove across the country from Chicago, I was at like middle school. I vaguely recall. Grottos are amazing. Yeah, they really are. So of course, some of them are underground, but this is a very strong sense of repeated shapes, the pointed rocks in the background of the grotto. And of course, all four human bodies create rhythm with their heads and even their faces, eyes, noses, mouths, and of course, arms and legs. So there's a lot of rhythm. Now for space, here we have overlapping, and then we'll go on to, because I'm only going to do a few of the elements of composition on each slide. Because once you get, let's say, by the time you write your paper on the 6 weeks, certainly familiar with how each one looks, then you should be able to do the analysis on your own. That's the goal, of course, of this first part of the class. But for now, we'll just do 4 or 5 on each, maybe 6 on some slides. So let's talk about space. Well, here we have overlapping, because you can see that baby Jesus is closer to us than his mom. Her hand is over his shoulder, but he's in front of her. And of course, John the Baptist is in front of his mother, and they're all four of them closer to us than the grotto, the background, because they all overlap the grotto. And then we have diminishing size, right, in which the objects get smaller the further back they go. If you miss Monday's lecture, you want to watch it on anytime after 8 p.m. Friday on YouTube, because we went into each of these elements of each technique, including several techniques for space. Then we have atmospheric perspective. He was using it. It isn't as obvious, but there's a kind of a slight bluish, hazy look, not so much here, but in the very most distant rocks off on the, almost to the horizon, which is what we see when we look off into the distance on a daytime view. I mean, it only applies in the daytime, where you see a blue hazy look to objects that are farthest away. So that's atmospheric perspective. We also know he used scientific perspective almost always. He wrote about that. So there was a vanishing point, probably somewhere behind this section of the rocks, the thickest part of the grotto. somewhere off to the far end of the horizon. There would be a common vanishing point and lines drawn by Da Vinci before he started painting, probably in pencil on the canvas, would all meet then. So that's, we covered this again on Monday. A definite, we know he used a scientific perspective in this. Okay, and then for color, we have almost neutral when it's very dark, like almost black, you know, in most of the grotto, and gray, and then kind of a misty, you know, color of whites and blues in the very far distance, or very light blue. But on the people, all human skin tones are considered warm. And of course, that is Mary's royal gown. It is supposed to meant to symbolize that she's like a queen, kind of a royalty in heaven anyway, is blue, and that's a cool color. Whereas here we have what looks like part of her cousin's robes, but it could even be some other kind, almost look like a backpack, doesn't it? This big heavy object. I don't think it's a pillow, it's too big. Behind her cousin, the mother of John the Baptist, is red. And of course, that's a warm color. And then all the human skin tones are warm. And then finally, we have thin outlines. So now I think I've done 6 of the elements. Thin outlines, there's no bold outlines here. You'll see that when we get next week, when we get to Michelangelo. But this is a period when most painters, including Da Vinci, just use thin outlines around mostly the human bodies or some objects. Here, they're mostly just the 4 figures in the front. Okay, let's move on to this painting, and I think you've all seen it, including maybe some of you, badly reproduced images, you know, in velvet on the walls of the garage or something, in a grade B comedy movie or something. And there are also versions of it with dogs playing cards. I mean, it's been so badly abused. I'm kidding. It's been so influential that people have made various satirical versions of it. But let's look at the original work. This is a slide, I'm telling you now, in case it's not obvious, it's on your list, that you don't want to forget to study. It is a very high, I'm going to give you guys clues now, and I'll say this again throughout the semester. When a slide is so important that I definitely will not cut it from the study list, so you have a higher probability of it being, I'm not saying definitely, but a high possibility of it being on the exam. You want to take good notes and study it carefully. This is one of those slides. It's not going to get cut from the study list when we do the review for the first midterm. So count on the odds of it being at least 50-50 of being on the midterm. Okay, here we go. You probably all know the title. I don't have to spell these words. The Last Supper, 3 words, The Last Supper. I already spelled Da Vinci's name. Don't need to do it again. The date, we don't have to guess, 1498. Ken, I think a couple of you said you've been to Italy in your mini files. Anybody here seen this painting?
Me.
Oh, good. When were you there?
Oh my God, I've seen it at least 6 or 7 times.
Oh my goodness. That's
I've been
impressive.
going to Europe since I was 1.5 years.
I remember you saying something about that, and I think one of the first two lectures. So when's the most recent time you were there? There's a reason I'm asking.
Maybe 2002 or something.
Okay.
Last
then
time I saw that.
That's very similar. I was there in 2000, and the reason that matters, you don't have to write yet. I'll tell you when to start writing about the meaning. This painting was so badly deteriorated that it took 15 years to restore it, and it finally got restored, and the public was given a whole new, you know, even people that lived in Milan. It's in Milan on the wall of a monastery. So that's part of the context. I'll repeat that. The point is, finally, the year 2000, I was lucky enough, the Italian tourism ministry, because I'd written so many articles in other newspapers and magazines about other countries, I got an invitation to go, all expense paid, all over northern Italy. Well, from Rome all the way up, yeah, from Milan down to Rome. It was one of my favorite trips. And one of the main reasons was they want me to see this and write about this. It had just been restored. So now let's start writing about the meaning. What do we see here? Again, probably most of you know some of these facts, but if you don't, you should be writing this. The illustration part of the meaning is usually what I will start with on any realistic work of art. Well, this is clearly realistic. It's not abstract. So this, here we go, is a scene from the Bible in which Jesus met for the last time with all of his disciples, right? And he told them he knew one of them had betrayed him. one of those 12 disciples had betrayed him. He knew that, and he forgave that person. It's a very powerful moment in the history of, well, religion or Christianity or the Bible, however you want to write that. Obviously, it's a scene that typically was very, very popular with Renaissance painters. And Da Vinci just happens to have done the most famous version of it. And there are several reasons why. We'll start with the fact that here he uses chiaroscuro in a limited way. The walls of the building on the sides and in the back have chiaroscuro. But there's another technique he uses here, and it's called sfumato. Sfumato. So that's our next definition. You see, it's on the list between high Renaissance, on your list of terms, right? But it's not a long difference between high Renaissance and chiaroscuro. Sfumato with an F, right? Well, it's in front of you. I don't need to spell it. Sfumato. What does that mean? It's a light wash over part or all of a painting, which creates a smoky, hazy effect. That's the simplest way to describe it. You can get more detail and much more depth, but again, we are a survey course. So I'll say it again for purposes of the exam, if it's on the exam. Let's say, well, some of the definitions will appear on the exam. Sfumato would be the use, you could say the use of, is probably better, a light wash over part or all of the painting to create a smoky, hazy effect. Well, here's where the debate comes in. And I'll bet, I'm sorry, I actually should get your name, who had just told us she was here after 2000. Sorry, who was that?
Tanya,
Yeah, okay, spell your name again, because I want to make sure I remember it.
Tonia.
Okay. Tanya, thank you for your participation. I was going to ask you, did you have a guided tour? Because I went through with an art expert.
I think that there was. This was a long time ago. I think that there was.
And there's a documentary, did you see it? That's in multiple languages. And for me, they played it in English about the restoration. Well, here's why I brought that up. It's part of the meaning that now you should add as a second or third fact in your notes on meaning of this painting, which is this painting probably did not use sfumato consciously, because historians have most or many, to be safe to say, many historians believe it deteriorated very soon after it was painted because of an unintended effect of a fixative. That's not a wash. That's something to preserve a painting. It's a fresco. I should have started with that. Sorry. It's part of the meaning. The context is what? That it's a fresco. Already defined a fresco. Obviously, it's a painting on wet plaster on, it's a part of the context meaning, on the wall of a monastery in Milan. That's one of the biggest cities in Italy. Again, it's a fresco on the wall of a monastery in Milan, Italy, of course. Okay, so did he use sfumato? It looks like it here, but many historians, and I think I agree with that, think it's just an unintended after effect. So what I'm going to tell you, we're going ahead a little bit, is when we get to, the Mona Lisa, I think we've already overshot that. Yeah, you are going to see sfumato. We'll get to that as our third slide for today, but let's do it chronologically here. So just say that there's no proof that Da Vinci was using that technique this early. He didn't invent it. Most historians would not claim that. Some people used to say he invented sfumato. We know he invented chiaroscuro. I already said that. So just say that some historians believe he used a sfumato or wash over part of this painting, but many others feel that it's just a deterioration that occurred from the chemical process of a fixative, right? That's meant to preserve a painting, not to create a smoke hazy effect. That he, in other words, bought a defective product from some traveling salesman. I know it sounds corny, but I've read that actually there were such people in Renaissance Italy who would travel all over Europe, and especially in Italy where the Renaissance was at its height, and go to artist studios and say, hey, I've got something for you, use this and you'll preserve your painting for, and then whoop, sometimes it had the opposite effect. That's part of why it's had to be restored. The other reason, and I'm sure Agania, you know, you heard about this, is because it's 500 years old and it's subject to
Mhm.
moisture and tourist breath. So you
Flash.
should mention that as part of the meaning. This painting was being damaged by 1 million or more people a year. I think it was closer to 2, but just say over 1 million people a year for decades were coming and getting up close. They didn't limit you as to how close you could get. You know, you couldn't touch it, but you know, if you got too close, a guard would tell you.
Ooh, I
step
never
back.
did.
Well, how about you? Were you able to get close? I had to say
Yes, I was, but I never touched it because I knew better.
yeah, right. But artists, I mean, not artists,
But I
tourists
saw people doing that.
would, touching it. Oh, they should have been.
Yeah.
convicted. No, I
This was
didn't. When I was
little
there,
and they would
there was a
let you
rope.
touch it, but
Hmm.
you could get arrested. if you
Yes,
just-
yes, of course, because it's irreplaceable. So it needed to be restored because of just say how many centuries it had existed on the wall, and it was subject to both moisture and, well, tourist breath. What is that? It is moisture. And I'm not
Mhm.
talking about the garlic in Italian cooking by itself. The smell isn't what we're talking about. It's the moisture and tourist breath. So all forms of moisture, both from human and weather conditions, were deteriorating the painting. Plus, it might have deteriorated even early on, right, shortly after it was finished, because of a poor choice of a fixative. There's no other word for that, fixative.
Didn't the flash from the cameras also?
That could, yeah,
contribute to that?
probably. Yeah, I think
That's
you're
what
right.
I always was told.
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah, it would make sense. So I was allowed to take it with no flash, but I was given a private audience. I had 15 minutes with an art expert who lived in Milan. I was very lucky. He's the cousin of one of my best friends. And she had him meet me at the train station and take me in privately. I was very lucky. I got up close, but I didn't want to get too close because I knew no matter, you know, what your breath smells is not the point. It's the moisture. It could damage it. So it had just been restored. So you can mention that it took 15 years and millions of dollars to restore it.
Mhm.
And that was done. You could just say recently. You don't have to say what year, but it was finished in the year 2000 because that's supposedly the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Jesus. But we don't know exactly when Jesus was born. But according to, you know, modern historians, it's the approximate and 2000th anniversary of his birth. So that's when this was restored. Now, the other part of the meaning is the iconography or the symbolism of what's going on here. Jesus's hands are on the table, and especially this would be his left hand with his palm up. That symbolizes his acceptance of his fate. Look at his face. That does too. He was accepting that he could have tried to escape. He could have gotten away. He had advance warning about the Romans going to come arrest him, and he didn't even try to escape. So he just figured that was what God, quote, his father, unquote, you'd say God, determined it would be his fate. He would have to accept it. So he's accepting his imminent arrest and death, you know, with his gestures. The gestures he's using are symbolic of his state of mind. Now, that's a Da Vinci technique, so you could add that as part of what makes Da Vinci one of the greatest painters of the Renaissance, that he developed a technique of showing the inner, I'll say this twice, Da Vinci developed, or is the first famous painter to use a technique of indicating, or you could say, showing the inner thoughts and feelings of the subjects with gestures and facial expressions, with, you could say, body language or gestures and their facial expression, both. His facial expression here, by the way, this is my own slide of this. They allow me to take it from a distance here. And you can see how they restored it, very light touch. You probably remember that, right? That it wasn't gaudy, like it was for centuries, overlaid with later people painting on just their own guess of what the original colors were. So the artist who restored it, and she was an artist, went blind. Now you could write that as part of the meaning. She literally lost her eyesight during that 15-year project because she had to get up right on a ladder, of course, very close to every square centimeter or very fraction of an inch to get little tiny specks of paint from the original paint that Da Vinci used, and then take them to a lab and have them reproduced and then applied. And that's a process that, of course, you see why it would have taken 15 years. So anyway, back to the other symbols here. Then we have the body language of the other disciples. Look at this is Peter. Let's go back to the whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Yeah, the full view. Peter's hands, he's always shown, is the first and oldest disciple, is always, bald with a beard. His hands are raised, and that gesture indicates his inner thoughts is denial or disbelief. Even you could just say disbelief. He doesn't believe that anyone in the room would betray Jesus, and that he's about to be arrested and probably executed. He's literally, almost you could hear him saying, "No, it can't be." The same is true of these disciples on this side of Jesus, on his left side. And this one here is even saying, "Oh, did he say what we thought? Or did he really say he's about to be arrested, or one of us betrayed him?" They're all saying this can't be. But there is one here who is not showing a surprised or disbelief reaction of surprise or disbelief. And that would be Judas, the one who accepted the money, according to the Bible, from the Romans, the coins that the Romans paid him to betray Jesus. And Jesus knows who it was, and he knows that Jesus knows. He's the only one not acting with surprise. Now, this is an important detail. Some of you may have noticed, I'm not sure if when you were there, I mean, if this came up or not, but I had studied this before. I was already been teaching at the JC for several years by then, but I read about it before, and then I asked that expert who was my guide, and I've read much since. This figure here of Judas is the only one shown with a darker skin tone or complexion than the others. So it could be, some people might assume, but they'd be wrong, and I'll say why, that could be a racist commentary. Oh, well, of course, the only guy that's the villain in this scene would be Judas, and he's shown was the only person in the room with a darker skin tone. But guess
I
what?
remember them saying that.
But it's not, because Da Vinci not only was not a racist or prejudiced, we don't have to guess about this. He left thousands of pages of notebooks, you know this, many of you, about everything. He studied the whole world, and other cultures fascinated him. In fact, this is not an exact quote, but he's had statements in some of those notebooks about prejudice of all kinds is a stupid waste of human potential. And he never wanted to see that happen. But of course, that was the norm at that time in much of the world, certainly in Europe. So it wasn't about racism. So why would he be shown with a slightly darker skin tone? Because it's an ancient dramatic technique going back to Greek theater and Roman theater. In Greek and Roman plays, live plays, the lighting would be used to symbolize or point out for the audience who the villain was before the villain did their deed, right? Committed their crime. It's a dramatic device. It has nothing to do with they were all Jewish and all darker skin tone than most Europeans would have been, of course, and they were from the Middle East. So it's not about his ethnic or racial background. It's not that at all. But that's not a minor detail. I think it's important to mention, because I've had a few students ask that question over the years. But there's one more bit of controversy, and this one, maybe more than one or two of you will have. Who is this disciple? Well, there's a debate. Some say it's perhaps, I can't remember if it's Michael or one of the other younger male disciples, but there was a female disciple. Her name was Mary, as you probably know. And if you don't, you want to write that. Not the other Mary. His mother obviously wasn't one of his disciples. Mary Magdalene, don't ask me to spell it, write it like it sounds. Mary Magdalene, his only female disciple, is who, and I believe this is accurate, personally, as many historians do. Just say again, many historians believe that the disciple on Jesus's far right was his only female disciple, right? And that would be Mary, because he always wanted her, according to the Bible, to sit on his right-hand side, closest to him. And look at the emotional reaction that if it is that person, this person is actually Mary, the other Mary Magdalene, the only female disciple. Obviously, she's had an emotional reaction to knowing that, her beloved, right, inspirational leader is going to die soon. But there's no certainty of that. There are plenty of historians who say, no, somehow this was just a scene with only male disciples. But that begs the question is, why would Da Vinci, when he wasn't sexist or racist, as we just described, leave out the only female disciple? I think it's Mary Magdalene. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning. Let's do the formal analysis. Balanced? Yes. Jesus is in the middle, and it's completely balanced. The number of niches, that's what they are, niches. They're not windows. They're niches in the walls are, of course, exactly even. And we've got, the same number of disciples, 6 on each side. And then we have the rhythm of the human bodies, the pieces of bread you see on the table, the windows in the back wall, and, heads, hands, arms, and so forth. Then we have the fact is when it was new, it was a sharp, you could say, or realistic cement texture. It's more faded or soft looking, but that's not, it's important to know that, remember in your notes, I already told you that we know it had to be a light touch. They call that restoration. So it would have been much sharper originally. But even with the sort of faded look, you can tell that there is a realistic cement texture on the clothing, the hair, the skin, and the room. It's got atmospheric perspective, obviously, in the hills. It's clearly got overlapping of each of the objects and diminishing size of each of these niches, the farther away they get. And clearly there's a vanishing point right behind Jesus's head. So it's got scientific perspective. And then foreshortening on the walls and the table. They get narrower as they go further away from us. Is it stable or dynamic? Well, I'd say it's both, because the room is mostly stable. The table is stable. Hopefully it's not tilting, but the point is that we see the diagonals at this perspective, this angle that we're looking at from Da Vinci's composition, as well as all the human bodies, or not all, but just many of the disciples' bodies are leaning or tilted, right? In motion, because they've just heard this terrible announcement about Jesus's imminent arrest. And so they're more dynamic than Jesus is mostly stable. So it's a mixture of stable and dynamic. And again, the lines are all going to be thin outlines. Okay. Actually, that slide, I'm sorry, that's the one I bought there. That's right. Because I didn't have I only could use a tripod. So this is how it looked when I was standing about 10 feet away. Yeah.
A different perspective. So it's kind of nice for people to see that.
Yeah. I took them with that in mind. In fact, that's why one reason I was given that private tour, 15 minutes, but it's enough to, I was in tears. By the time I left, once you know what you're looking at, it's amazing. Yeah, it's very impressive.
Very emotional.
Yeah, it is.
Can I add something?
Sure.
You guys, we wouldn't have that to look at had they were teachers and scientists that were like undercover soldiers that covered that up. We would not have that had they not have covered that up.
During World War II, it was almost destroyed. The monastery around it was bombed, and somehow, I don't know, you call it what you want, divine intervention, a miracle.
They had the sense enough to cover it up.
Yes, they protected it. You're right, exactly. Okay, this one, everyone knows what it is. I think you've heard the name in English, but that's not the name in Europe where it's on display. Mona Lisa. M-O-N-A, of course, 2 words, Lisa, L-I-S-A. I'm not going to spell Da Vinci's name again, 1504. This is going to take some time to describe. We're going to go to 420. I can't go too much later than that. In other words, today is one of the exceptions where I can't stick around after the lecture's over, because I've got to meet with a teaching assistant and another area outside campus. And so I'll stick around after all the other classes almost every other day. So let's just get right to it. Well, it's just, you can say it's the most famous painting in the world. I think there's no argument over that. It's one of the best known, you could just say it that way, paintings ever created. And this one has both chiaroscuro around her arms and hands, but also around her neck. And let's go to a close-up or two, which you can see here, right? The contrasting areas of light and dark, even around her eyes and lips and nose, to emphasize the parts of her face he wanted you to notice. And you see them around the hands even more so, because their lower body has more darker areas, or chiaroscuro, than the upper part of her body. But here, there's no question he's using sfumato, that technique of a light wash to create a smoky, hazy effect. The background has sfumato. So he used both techniques, which were nearly brand new. And he invented, remember, chiaroscuro. So again, it's obvious why. If this is on the exam, again, I'm not cutting this slide. It's so important. You could easily say part of the meaning is it was a high Renaissance painting by one of the greatest Renaissance painters, and the reasons why he invented these techniques. All right, but what do we know about who she is? Well, we don't have to guess about who she is. Her real name was La Gioconda. I'll spell that for you. La, that would be her last name. Her married name She married a man named Giocondo. He was a wealthy merchant. So she was the fiance. I'll say it again slowly. We know this was painted before the marriage of a woman to a man named Giocondo. And why don't you just write her name, therefore became, and everybody else in the world outside of this country calls this painting La, two words, Gioconda, Gioconda, just like it sounds, the last name of the man she married. So we know it's a portrait of a woman about to get married to a wealthy, powerful man. That doesn't tell us though what's in her mind or her thoughts or in her heart. That's where the debate or the various theories have come up. Some of you know these, but if you don't know these theories, you want to write a couple of them. One theory is that she had perhaps some kind of interest. Now, nobody debates Da Vinci was gay, but back then he didn't, advertise it. Like I said, he didn't openly flaunt it. So maybe she didn't know that, and she might have been attracted to him, perhaps even flirting with him. It's possible. It doesn't sound likely to me, though. I don't think so. If she was happily engaged and about to be married, she probably, you'd think she probably wouldn't flirt with the man hired by her husband to paint her portrait. So many historians believe it is a gift, meant to be a gift from her future husband, a wedding present, if you want to call it that, or engagement present, but probably given to her. He intended to. Guess what? She never got it. Da Vinci kept it his whole. These are the facts we don't have to guess on. There's no debating this. The man who commissioned it didn't like it. Fool that he was. He didn't know what he was passing up, but just say it that way. He did not like it for some reason. We don't know why. Maybe he thought she was flirting with Da Vinci. We don't know why. He refused to accept it. You could just say he rejected it. And so Da Vinci kept it with him his whole life, wherever he traveled, all over Western Europe. He traveled a lot. He rarely stayed in one city more than a few years. He kept this painting because it was his favorite painting of the ones, at least, that were portraits. So that begs the question as to whether or not there's some other hidden meaning, such as the fact that some think she looks sad, some people think she looks happy. It's up to each person's interpretation. But those who think that she's hiding, there's even a song, Nat King Cole, one of the, if not the greatest singer of the 20th century, one of my dad's favorites, was a song called Mona Lisa. Do you smile to hide a broken heart? A bunch of singers sang that song. And of course, poems have been written, books have been written about it. Maybe she had a miscarriage, or she was in an arranged marriage. That's very likely, because most women didn't have a choice in who they married then, upper or lower class. Maybe more so in the upper classes, they would be pressured or forced into marrying someone by their parents or, some family member. So maybe she was about to enter an arranged marriage and not happy, or hiding a broken heart. Some think she even could have had a miscarriage and been sad for that reason. We don't know, is the point. What we do almost certainly know is a bogus theory that a book was written about a few years ago after I started teaching. It's a self-portrait of Da Vinci in drag. You know what that's based on? Lack of research. Yes, there is a self-portrait of himself under this because he was never wealthy. Da Vinci never made much money. You'd think he did, but he didn't off of his art. He wasn't homeless or dirt poor, but he never he wasn't interested in money. He didn't pay for money. He accepted the fees, but this one he didn't get paid for, right? Because it was rejected. So the fact that he used the same canvas and painted over one of his own self-portraits doesn't prove diddly. So that theory's been debunked. It's not a self-portrait of him in drag. In fact, he didn't dress in drag. We know that because we know what his clothes are still in several historical museums in parts of Italy, or at least national archives where they're kept, I'm sure, airtight so they don't deteriorate. We know what kind of clothes he wore. He wrote whole journals about his clothing and his furniture and things like that, what he did on them. So it's not Da Vinci in drag, even if you've heard that's pretty well defunct. We just don't know for sure who it is. Why she's smiling this way, and whether there is any kind of hidden emotions. But those are the theories. Okay, formal analysis. Well, I just said the modeling. Remember, Chiaroscuro's kind of modeling is very strong here, especially around her hands, and also her her face, particularly her neck and also eyes. And then there is the soft or diffuse, you can use either word, effect of smoky, hazy look to the landscape, which makes that simulated texture on the rocks and the road behind her not as sharp, and therefore some would say less realistic, but no, it's all realistic. It's just not as sharp, strong, the simulated texture, as it is on her body, her arms and hands, her clothing, her hair. The color's mostly warm. She's got kind of a golden brown type of color or tannish color to her robes. And the background, the bottom part or closest part of the landscape is warm, right? Yellows and reds in the earth of Italy, you see that a lot. And then further back you get into, of course, of the atmospheric perspective effect is very strong here. So that creates a, of course, blue hazy look, which by definition is cool. So the upper half of the background is mostly cool. For space, we have, I just mentioned, atmospheric perspective. Definitely, he always used scientific perspective. So the vanishing point would be behind her head there on the horizon. And everything fades evenly, as in all scientific perspective paintings. Also, obviously overlapping, her arms overlap her waist, her clothes are overlap her body, and she's overlapping the balcony. It's a balcony she's sitting on, by the way. And of course, she overlaps the landscape. There's the diminishing size of the rocks behind her. Here there is foreshortening. I used to say I don't see much, but now when you look closely, you can see there is on her shoulders and on somewhat on the arm, the one arm that would be her right arm. So there is foreshortening. Okay, and then rhythm. Well, all human bodies have rhythm, but her clothing, especially the folds of her robes, the sleeves, her bodice, I guess it is, and her hair, and her, of course, hands, eyes, right? And the rocks behind her create strong rhythm. Is it stable or dynamic? It's mostly stable on her. She's pretty much sitting upright, and her arms are almost at a right angle to us, or to her body, I bet. And then in the background, you could say it's more dynamic. So it's both. The largest mass, easy, her, then the balcony. And if you count the landscape as a single mass, you could look at it that way, then that would be the third largest. Otherwise, you probably want to say that this group of rocks in the upper, if you break the landscape into different masses, in the upper left side of the painting is the third largest mass. All the lines are thin, and it is roughly balanced left to right, but there are people who make, and I would not dispute this, there's some more empty space, not a lot more, but a little more on her, well, on our left side, that would be her right shoulder, than there is off to her left. So you could say it's slightly unbalanced. I would say that too. Even at first glance, it looks roughly balanced. It's technically slightly unbalanced toward the right, in our view, and definitely unbalanced toward the bottom, because obviously her head and neck are narrower than her body. Okay, moving on. It's the most intriguing face, some people think, in European history of painting anyway. I have to stop for a minute. This is an amazing painting. You don't have to write this. This is not a must know. I always do that when we get to a slide that isn't on the syllabus. I don't want to confuse you. I'll say you don't need to take notes, but maybe one or two of you might choose to do some research or extra credit, or even write perhaps a paper, your research paper. This fascinates me. I've forgotten the name of the woman, and it's not that important that I have it written down, but this was a high-ranking noble woman from, I think, northern Italy, who was friends with Da Vinci. They wrote many letters to each other, and she promoted his art and helped him get, various, commissions, which helped him, of course, professionally and economically, perhaps in some cases, helped him pay the rent. And she not only believed in him, she really cared about him. They were platonic friends. And look at the intelligence of this woman's face. It's almost like this could have been a photograph taken last week or something. And you can see how he respected women's intelligence. Like I said, he had no sexism or prejudices or racism, and not a bone in his body. It was, obviously extremely intelligent. Some think the highest IQ of any famous artist, well, certainly one of the highest, on a par with Einstein is what I've read. And he just didn't have time for stupid prejudices. And so he admired intelligent women and was friends with many of them, but this is probably the one he was closest friends to. They exchanged poems and things. And he would visit her villa, and her husband was, happy with the fact that the famous painter would come to stay, so there was no issue. It's just fascinating, this portrait. And look at the chiaroscuro, the black background. This is much later, right before he died. In fact, 1515, he died a few years later. But it's not a must know. Okay, we're going to do the School of Athens. I have to go forward. Here we go. Because I want to say it's too much to cram both Michelangelo and Da Vinci into 1 hour and 10 minutes on the same lecture. We'll do Michelangelo next week. Okay, this is the next must know, very important. I won't cut this one from the study list. The title is School of Athens, like the capital of Greece, right? Athens, of course, it's in front of you, but I'll spell that. City, A-T-H-E-N-S, School of Athens, 3 words. The artist's name is Raphael. Don't spell it like the city in Marin County. It's not that. Of course, you have it in front of you, but I'll spell it. His last name was R-A-P-H-A-E-L, Raphael, 1511. This is one of the most famous paintings in the history of the Renaissance, and it's clearly a high Renaissance painting. And again, there's some debate on this, but not much. Most historians consider Raphael one of the 3 most important painters of the entire Renaissance, and certainly one of the most famous and successful during his lifetime. The other 2, we already know, Da Vinci and Michelangelo. He's considered one of the top 3. And there's a reason why he was so successful, because he combined some of the techniques of Da Vinci and Michelangelo and created his own style. It's called the synthesis. Some of you who are creative artists in your own right, I know from the many bios that several of you are painters or engravers and photographers. You may know what that means. You mean you could be influenced by another artist, but you're not copying or mimicking a specific artist or style. You're blending different elements into creating your own style. So Raphael created his own style of high Renaissance painting by incorporating some, not all, but some of the techniques of both Da Vinci and Michelangelo. That's the first fact to mention, and why it's called high Renaissance, and why he's considered one of the 3 greatest painters of the Renaissance. Another fact is the context. Where is it? It's a fresco on the wall of a library in the Vatican. That's where the Pope lives. You can just say the Pope's home, but why not use the right word? That's V-A-T-I-C-A-N, the Vatican, where the Pope is. So again, it's a fresco on the wall of there's a bunch of libraries in the Vatican, of one of the Pope's libraries in the Vatican, which of course is within Rome. It's a separate country within Rome. Don't ask me if you don't know about that. You don't need to know how that happened. But anyway, it is. It has its own flag, its own embassies, right? And ambassadors.
Currency.
Yeah, say again, pardon?
It has its own currency and its own mailbox.
Yeah, that's right. And its own court system. And some think they didn't do a very good job on certain things. But in any case, it's a separate small country within Italy. But just say, you can just keep it simple and say within Rome. It's where the Pope lives, and it's called the Vatican with a capital V. So it's on the wall of one of those libraries. And guess what? It's right around the corner from the Sistine Chapel, which we covered last week. That is the chapel where Michelangelo's painting, several paintings of the ceilings of the Sistine, or ceiling, it's one ceiling. So once again, all of Michelangelo's paintings in the Sistine Chapel, because he also painted the walls later. He had 2 major projects in the same chapel. They're right around the corner. So you might guess, and you'd be right. So go ahead and write this. Part of the meaning is that Raphael, who was a generation younger than Michelangelo and Da Vinci, well, they were several years apart. Da Vinci was the oldest, then Michelangelo, and then Raphael was much younger. Raphael was influenced by Michelangelo's and inspired, is a better word, inspired. Oh, hang on, saying my internet connection. There we go. Now when it does that on the screen, I pause. Okay, you guys can hear me now. This is a really important painting. So he was inspired by watching Michelangelo paint the Sistine Chapel. Did he stand underneath him while paint was dripping and smoke from the torches? No, he would wait till Da Vinci was done each night, and then secretly he had a key. We just say many historians believe Raphael was given access by the Pope to get inspiration for this painting from the next door paintings on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Not a minor fact, a very important part of the meaning, the context of it. So we know he adopted a couple of elements of Da Vinci's and Michelangelo's style. So let's say the illustration method of the meaning, and then we'll talk about those techniques, the main other fact of the meaning here. The illustration aspect is it's an imaginary scene. Okay, an imaginary scene in which all of the greatest artists and scientists of ancient Greece are gathered in one place, gathered together in one place. Of course, that didn't happen. They lived centuries apart. But the other part of the meaning is very important, equally, if not more so than that fact. An imaginary gathering of people who didn't all ever appear together at one time, is that some of the figures have a contemporary identity, meaning that they were also portraits of Renaissance artists, and we don't have to guess about some of them. So these figures, some of them, not all of them, had dual identities or dual meanings. For instance, this guy here would be Plato, but he's also Da Vinci. We know Da Vinci looked like this. He was so famous, all kinds of portraits were painted and drawings of him and busts while he was alive. So that is the dual identity of the guy in the orange robe in the middle who's pointing up to the sky, is the ancient philosopher, one of the first great Greek philosophers, Plato, but also Da Vinci. This is the Greek sculptor Myron, and I'll spell his name for you. We're not going into that because we don't cover ancient Greek art, but in the ancient world, this would have meant this figure on a piece of stone with a chisel somewhere, right? Is Myron, M-Y-R-O-N. But the current or contemporary identity, as in Renaissance identity, is Michelangelo, disgusted and discouraged. Why? Because he was forced to paint the Sistine Chapel, breathing fumes every night, and he wasn't even being paid for it until after finally at the end he got paid. So for 4 years he worked with little or no pay. Of course he would have been disgusted with that, but he couldn't say no. The Pope had an army, quite literally. We'll talk about that next week, what happened with the Sistine Chapel. But just for now, keep it simple and say this figure here down leaning on the piece of stone is symbolic of both an ancient Greek sculptor named Myron, I already spelled his name, as well as Michelangelo. And then we'll just do two more. This figure here is another ancient Greek philosopher. There are several different possibilities. Archimedes, or you can just say one of the more famous Greek mathematicians. But the current Renaissance identity of the guy right here with the book is the architect of St. Peter's. This building is inspired clearly by St. Peter's, which was under, I'll repeat this, under construction while this painting was being made. St. Peter's, the largest church on earth, it still is to this day, was just partly finished when this painting was done. And you see an unfinished Renaissance style building where these people supposedly were all gathering. So who was the architect? Bramante, I'll spell his name. We're going to talk about him next week. It's a pretty important person in the Renaissance in terms of architecture. He was an architect in the Renaissance, a real person, contemporary with this painting that it's based on. I'll spell his name again, capital B-R-A-M-A-N-T, Bramante. The architect of the actual church, St. Peter's, on which this building or setting is based. And then one more meaning we don't have to even guess is no dual meaning. That's a self-portrait of Raphael himself. By the way, he died at 37, very young, very young. I think it was tuberculosis, anyway, some illness took him, right the height of his success. He became quite successful, and he was kind of friendly rivals with both Da Vinci and Michelangelo. They each kind of had a bit of an ego. I mean, that happens when you become very famous and successful. But Raphael was actually more financially well off than Michelangelo. At times had some decent income because he lived so long and produced so many important works. Whereas I just said Da Vinci rarely had much money. And again, he was not, in danger of becoming homeless or anything like that, but he never was really wealthy. Raphael was wealthy at some point before he died, because he was so successful and popular. Okay, that's pretty much the whole meaning here. Let's do a formal analysis. And then I'm going to tell you that I may wait to cover The Tempest next, at the beginning of our next lecture, okay, on Monday. Okay, this is balanced, well, isn't it? I mean, look at, obviously roughly balanced with a group of figures down here in the lower right, closest to the viewer, in the lower, lower left corner, and on the lower right, roughly equal areas of groups of people. And then a group here coming into the scene, another group here, you can see it's very carefully balanced. And the group on the top step clearly roughly equal numbers left to right if you use Da Vinci / Plato as the central figure. Therefore, it's roughly balanced left to right. And I would say top to bottom. It just depends on how you look at it. Because even though this looks like empty space, it isn't. There's a solid stone building up above the heads of all these people, and then a huge curved ceiling and a giant archway through which they're all going to pass. I think it's roughly balanced both ways. Clearly, the rhythm is powerful on the arches, on the sculpture, on the walls, right, on either side, and all the human figures, obviously with their heads, hands, arms. There's lots of rhythm that draws your eye around. The composition as rhythm is always meant to do. So you kind of want to look through the whole thing maybe more than once or twice. I've stood in front of this painting several times. I assume you saw it, right? Because if you got to Rome and didn't see this, you kind of would have missed a major work of art that's really was very influential. Okay, what techniques for space? Well, it's all the major ones. I actually, atmospheric perspective is debatable, but you could say it's used on the clouds here. But then again, the sky normally would have that. So it's a matter of how you interpret that slight hazy look to the sky in the distance. But it definitely has a vanishing point, right, between these two. People think one of them is Plato and the other is Aristotle. And assuming that Aristotle has the blue cape on, I'm not sure if he also is symbolic of a contemporary Renaissance artist. I only gave the ones that most people agree or are sure of in terms of dual identities. Okay, so there's diminishing size. Obviously, the figures in the front are closer. There's overlapping, that's obvious, of the figures over each other and the walls behind them. There's foreshortening of the stairs and the walls. And I think that's the major techniques. Oh yeah, you could say that there is a register line here because each step is like a different section or line across left to right across the painting. So you could make the case that this guy's in, a little bit further away than the ones at in front of the bottom step. You could call that a kind of register towards line. Thin outlines? No, actually bold on the human figures. Look carefully. He's imitating Michelangelo here, who invented technique. So that's how he blended. The human emotions are clearly, or thoughts in the minds of each of these figures, at least the main figures like, Michelangelo and Da Vinci, are indicated by their body language, right? Their poses. That's a Da Vinci technique. I've already mentioned that. And so he borrows that from Da Vinci, and then he borrows the bold outline from Michelangelo. Okay, but then is there a thin outline? Well, yes, along the building, the walls of the building itself. The rhythm I've already mentioned. Oh, is it stable or dynamic? Well, obviously the ceilings are dynamic, including this major archway here, as well as the actual ceiling of the building they're in. But mostly it's stable. There's obviously this. Some people think this is Archimedes here, or I don't know. There's a debate on that. But just say that the sprawled figure on the middle step, he's dynamic, and maybe the Michelangelo / Myron, the sculptor figure. But most of them are standing upright, and the building walls, until you get to the ceilings above, pretty stable. So it's more stable than dynamic. The largest mass would be, if you count the wall and the ceiling behind them as a single mass, which it really would be in a building here. And this would be where the dome, it hadn't been built yet. The dome was designed by Michelangelo. We'll talk about that next week. So they hadn't gotten to the dome yet. That took decades later. Anyway, so the part of the building that's completed, which is based on St. Peter's Church, if you count that as a single mass, I'd have to say that's the largest mass. But some people break that down and say, no, the walls are a separate mass on each side. That's up to you. In which case, this main archway would be the largest mass, then the staircase, and then each human figure. You decide. Some people think all the human figures on the top step are one mass because they overlap. Well, that's up to you. It's fine. Decide. Okay, and then the colors are alternating warm, cool, warm, cool, warm. You see that on the robes, the different colors of oranges, reds, yellows, and golds. And then let's see, rhythm, balance, mass, space. I think for now, and textures, the realistic cinematic textures are very strong here. They would be in any Renaissance painting, at least by the most talented Renaissance painters, on the hair, the skin, the clothing, and the stonework of the building. Okay. So I'm going to stop the share, and I have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, but in about 3 or 4 minutes, I have to go meet somebody. So is there any urgent questions about what we just covered? Now, next week, we're going to see some of the most important slides for this whole semester. of Michelangelo's work, and then get into later Renaissance, because we're going to move quickly, more quickly than we would if this was only a Western art course. Like 2.2 does only Renaissance art. I mean, sorry, I meant Western art. But we'll have time. I think we'll just break down the next week. You see, it's a longer list, but we'll break it into 2 halves, of course. So read ahead. That's all your assignment. If people keep asking me, what's the assignment this week? There is no written assignment until we get to the 6th week when your paper's due. We will talk about how to write the paper next week. I will give you some instructions on that. We'll see how it goes, either Monday or Wednesday. Okay, any questions that are really just urgent enough that, in just a couple of minutes or so, I can.
You just want us to read more?
Yeah, what's on your syllabus? Yeah, read the
Okay.
chapters. This will be the next.
Because I thought I was missing something. I thought, wait a minute now.
16th century Renaissance art continued would mean you just read up to the end of any chapters in Stockstead that are about Renaissance art. And then in Gill, you got the chapter numbers that there's no debate over, and that's chapters 5 and 6 for week 3. And the same for each week until we get to the midterm. And then the reading will just be from Stockstead after the midterm, because you'll have finished each of the chapters 2 per week in Gill. And the other reading is optional. Those are the only required text. Okay, I'm going to sign off in a minute, but I'll give one more quick opportunity for anyone who has an urgent question.
Your lectures, you said, are on YouTube.
Yes, under I've already mentioned, but I'll say it again. Under Mark Wilson's SRJC, right? The initials.
Okay, got it.
Art history lectures, and by week, you'll see the topic in the week, but it all tracks with the syllabus
Okay.
by 8 p.m. on Friday. Okay, any of you guys have any other questions? All right, then you guys have a good week and do your reading, and it's going to be exciting when we talk. There's a major controversy. I'll give you a heads up on one of Michelangelo's paintings, which is the creation of Adam. See if you can, if you want to, you don't have to, you can read a little on your own on the internet. It's easy to find. What are the controversies in that painting? It's just about a scene from the Bible where God creates the first, quote, human. Well, there's a lot more to it than that, and there's a big debate over what might be a hidden meaning. And I think the hidden meaning is delivered by Michelangelo. We'll talk about that among other things next week. All right, you guys have a good weekend. See you.
Thank you, you too.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
You're welcome.